The old train yard was a quiet place after midnight, blanketed in the soft silver glow of the moon. Rows of abandoned carriages stood like forgotten relics, their rusting shells whispering secrets of journeys long past. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and iron, a haunting perfume that clung to the silence. Cassie had always found peace here, sketchbook in hand, capturing the eerie beauty of decay under the stars. Tonight was no different, at least that's what she told herself as she perched on the edge of a splintered bench, her pencil scratching faint lines on paper. But something was different. The silence, once comforting, felt heavier tonight, as if the shadows themselves were listening. Her eyes flicked toward the towering steel skeleton of an old crane, its elongated arms reaching skyward like frozen dancers. Was it her imagination, or had the shadows beneath its frame shifted? A soft scrape echoed behind her. Cassie froze, her heart quickening as she glanced over her shoulder. Nothing moved except for a stray newspaper tumbling in the breeze. She laughed nervously, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Then she saw a fleeting silhouette, impossibly tall, gliding between the train cars. Its movements were unnaturally fluid, its legs long and spindly, like those of a spider. Cassie's breath caught as she fumbled for her flashlight. The beam sliced through the darkness, but the figure was gone. Only the echoes of her own heartbeat remained. Cassie Morgan had always been drawn to forgotten places. Growing up in a bustling city where every corner was claimed by crowds and noise, she found solace in the quiet whispers of abandonment. Old train yards, crumbling buildings, overgrown parks, they spoke to her in a way that people never could. Her fascination began as a teenager when her father, a history professor, took her to an abandoned lighthouse on the coast. While others in the group marveled at the ocean views, Cassie lingered in the shadows of the lighthouse, sketching its weathered walls and peeling paint. Since then, her sketchbook had become a time capsule of lost places, a gallery of forgotten worlds she discovered one by one. Tonight, the train yard was her canvas. Located on the outskirts of town, it was a sprawling maze of rusting locomotives, twisted tracks, and hollowed-out carriages. The locals avoided it, muttering tales of strange sightings and inexplicable disappearances. But Cassie wasn't one to scare easily. She'd visited the yard dozens of times, finding beauty in its desolation and inspiration in its stillness. Cassie set down her thermos and flashlight on the bench beside her, flipping through pages of completed sketches. Each drawing was a fragment of a story she was still trying to piece together. Her latest project was the towering crane that loomed over the center of the yard. She called it the Sentinel, its skeletal frame both protective and ominous. As her pencil moved across the page, she found herself pausing more often than usual. The shadows seemed darker tonight, the silence more profound. She shook off the unease, convincing herself it was nothing more than fatigue. Her phone buzzed, breaking the stillness. It was her friend Jenna, who often teased Cassie about her nighttime excursions. "Still alive out there, spooky?" Jenna's voice crackled through the speaker. Cassie laughed. "Very funny. You like it here, though it's peaceful." "Peaceful?" Jenna scoffed. "That place gives me the creeps. I don't know how you do it." "I guess I see things differently." Cassie hesitated, glancing toward the crane. "Though I'll admit, it feels off tonight." "Off how?" "I don't know, just a feeling." Jenna's playful tone turned serious. "Well, don't stay too late. You hear those stories, right, about the thing people have seen out there?" Cassie rolled her eyes. "The tall shadow thing, come on, Jenna, you are smarter than that." "Smarter than you, apparently. Just be careful, okay?" Cassie promised she would and ended the call, but Jenna's words lingered. Stories of Longlegs, as locals called it, had circulated for years. A creature with unnaturally long limbs that stalked the train yard at night, appearing just at the edge of your vision. Most dismissed it as urban legend, but every now and then, a new story would surface, someone claiming to see it, or worse, being chased. Cassie stood and stretched, shaking off the unease. She wasn't here for ghost stories, she was here for art. But as she picked up her flashlight and swept it across the yard, she couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching her. She focused on the crane, its looming figure barely visible against the night sky. It felt like a guardian and a warning all at once. Beneath its shadow, the rusting train cars stood in perfect stillness, except for the faintest movement near the far end of the yard. Cassie narrowed her eyes. It was probably just a stray animal, she thought. But as she turned back to her sketchbook, a low rhythmic creaking echoed through the air. It sounded like metal bending, like something shifting its weight on unstable ground. Her pencil froze mid-stroke. She looked toward the crane again, but nothing seemed out of place. The shadows were just shadows, weren't they? Cassie's pulse quickened as the creaking sound faded into the stillness. She gripped her flashlight tightly, the small beam slicing through the thick darkness. The shadows beneath the crane seemed to stretch and shift, but when she blinked, they were still again. "It's just the wind," she muttered, though the night air was unnervingly still. Returning to her sketchbook, she tried to focus. The sentinel was nearly complete on the page, its sharp angles captured in painstaking detail. Yet the unease refused to let her fully immerse in her work. The memory of that fleeting silhouette danced at the edge of her thoughts, its spindly legs unnaturally long and its movements disturbingly fluid. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, a rhythmic scraping, like something heavy being dragged across the gravel. Cassie stood abruptly, the sketchbook slipping from her lap. The beam of her flashlight darted across the yard, illuminating train cars, tangled weeds, and rusting tracks. Nothing moved. The noise stopped. "Hello!" she called out, her voice trembling despite her attempted confidence. Silence. She exhaled shakily, forcing herself to sit back down. "You're imagining things," she whispered. "Too many ghost stories." But the stories were hard to forget. Longlegs was always described the same way, its limbs unnaturally elongated, its movements unnervingly smooth, and its presence accompanied by a strange metallic sound. Some said it fed on fear, while others believed it was a guardian of the forgotten, punishing those who lingered too long in its territory. Cassie shook her head, laughing softly at herself. She didn't believe in monsters. As she reached for her sketchbook, her flashlight flickered. The light dimmed, flared, then went out entirely. "Great," she muttered, smacking the flashlight against her palm. It sputtered to life for a moment, casting a faint glow before dying again. The yard was plunged into near total darkness, the moonlight too faint to provide much comfort. Cassie dug through her bag for her phone. The screen lit up, casting a pale light over her hands. She tapped on the flashlight app, grateful for the soft glow that replaced the failing beam. The scraping noise returned, louder now, and accompanied by a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from her left, near a row of overturned train cars. "Is someone there?" she called, her voice breaking. The tapping stopped. Cassie's instincts screamed at her to leave, but her curiosity held her in place. She took a cautious step toward the sound, her phone's light sweeping across the abandoned cars. Her heart pounded as the light caught movement, just a flicker, so quick she wasn't sure if she'd imagined it. A shadow darted between two cars, impossibly fast. "Okay, nope," she muttered, backing away. She fumbled for her bag, stuffing her sketchbook and thermos inside. Her hands were shaking so badly that she almost dropped her phone. The scraping sound started again, this time from directly behind her. Cassie spun around, the phone's light trembling in her hand. The beam fell on nothing but gravel and weeds. The night was still, the silence deafening. Then she saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows near the crane. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch far beyond what was natural. Its long arms dangled at its sides, swaying slightly as it moved. The legs were even longer, spindly and skeletal, yet it moved with a horrifying grace. Cassie's breath caught in her throat. She took a step back, then another, her phone's light fixed on the figure. What are you?" she whispered, though she didn't expect an answer. The figure tilted its head, as if studying her. Then it moved, slowly at first, each step deliberate, its long legs covering impossible distances. Cassie turned and ran. Her boots pounded against the gravel as she raced toward the yard's entrance. She didn't dare look back, but she could hear it, those rhythmic, scraping footsteps, impossibly fast despite their deliberate cadence. "Don't look back," she whispered to herself, clutching her phone like a lifeline. The entrance was just ahead, the faint outline of the chain-link fence visible in the moonlight. She could make it. She had to. But the sound was getting closer. The metallic scrape was deafening now, as if the creature was right behind her. Cassie reached the fence, her hands fumbling for the latch. The chain rattled as she pulled it open, stumbling through to the other side. She turned, slamming the gate shut and locking it with trembling hands. Her phone's light shone on the yard beyond. It was empty. The figure was gone. Cassie stood there, gasping for breath, her eyes scanning the shadows. The yard was silent again, the only sound her own ragged breathing. Had she imagined it? Was it just her mind playing tricks on her? But then she saw a single, elongated shadow stretching across the gravel, disappearing beneath the crane. And a tapping started again. Cassie's hands trembled as she gripped the chain-link fence, her breath visible in the icy night air. The shadow beneath the crane stretched impossibly long, moving as though it had a life of its own. Her mind raced, trying to rationalize what she had seen. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe her imagination had run wild. But the rhythmic tapping and the metallic scraping were undeniable. They echoed across the yard, measured and deliberate, as if to remind her she was not alone. The shadow shifted, flowing like liquid ink across the gravel. Cassie froze, unable to tear her eyes away. Slowly, impossibly, it began to rise. From the darkness beneath the crane, the figure emerged again, its elongated limbs moving with a nightmarish elegance. In the faint moonlight, its true form became clearer, a grotesque mockery of humanity, its skeletal frame draped in tattered, shadow-like wisps that seemed to melt into the night. Its face was featureless save for two glowing orbs where eyes should have been, piercing and unblinking. Cassie stumbled back, tripping over a rock and falling hard onto the dirt. The phone slipped from her hand, its light casting eerie shapes against the fence. The creature stepped closer, each movement unnervingly fluid. It didn't hurry. It didn't need to. Its long legs covered the distance effortlessly, closing in on her with a terrifying grace. Cassie's instincts screamed at her to run, but her body refused to move. She was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of the thing before her. "You don't belong here," she whispered, barely audible even to herself. The creature stopped, its head tilting sharply at her words. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then it crouched low, its spindly limbs folding unnaturally as it brought itself to her eye level. Cassie's breath hitched as she stared into its glowing eyes. They weren't empty, they were alive, swirling with fragments of light and shadow. Images flashed within them, fleeting fragmented glimpses of people she didn't recognize. Faces twisted in fear, moments frozen in time. She realized with a sickening certainty that these were its victims. The creature raised one elongated hand, its fingers impossibly thin and sharp, almost like blades. Cassie flinched, her hands instinctively raising to shield herself. But instead of striking, the creature hovered its hand over her head as if curious. A strange sensation washed over her, cold and weightless, like a veil being pulled from her mind. The images in its eyes shifted, and suddenly, she was among them. She saw herself, crouched in the shadows of the yard, sketchbook in hand. She saw her fear, her hesitation, and her fascination. The creature had been watching her all along, studying her every move. "What do you want?" she managed to whisper, her voice trembling. The creature tilted its head again, as if considering her question. Then, in a voice that was more a vibration in her mind than a sound, it spoke. "Leave." The word echoed through her, resonating in her bones. It wasn't a threat, it was a command, laced with an overwhelming sense of finality. Cassie nodded, her heart pounding. She scrambled to her feet, clutching her phone as she backed away from the fence. The creature straightened to its full, towering height, its glowing eyes fixed on her. She didn't dare look away as she stumbled toward the road, her legs shaky and her breath uneven. The scraping sound resumed, fading into the distance as the creature retreated into the shadows. When she reached her car parked on the side of the deserted road, she slammed the door shut and locked it, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and she drove away without looking back. In her rearview mirror, the train yard loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the horizon. But even as the yard disappeared from view, she couldn't shake the feeling that the glowing eyes were still watching her, waiting for her to return. Cassie didn't stop driving until she was well into the heart of the city, the comforting glow of streetlights and passing cars finally easing the icy grip of fear in her chest. She pulled into an all-night diner's parking lot, turning off the engine and resting her head against the steering wheel. Her mind replayed the events of the night like a broken record. The towering figure, the glowing eyes, the command that reverberated through her soul. It was all too vivid to be a hallucination, yet too surreal to feel real. Cassie reached for her bag, pulling out her sketchbook with trembling hands. The unfinished drawing of the crane stared back at her, a stark reminder of the yard's eerie desolation. Her pencil marks were precise, deliberate, yet the page felt incomplete, as if the sentinel itself was only a fraction of the truth. She flipped to a blank page and hesitated. Her hands itched to draw, to capture the creature's terrifying elegance, but she couldn't bring herself to put pencil to paper. Some things, she decided, were better left unwritten, better left forgotten. The diner's neon sign buzzed faintly in the background, a calming, mundane contrast to the oppressive silence of the train yard. Cassie stepped out of the car, the cool night air wrapping around her like a blanket. She needed coffee, something warm to ground her in the moment. Inside, the diner was nearly empty, save for a lone trucker at the counter and a waitress cleaning tables. Cassie slid into a booth, her back to the window, and ordered a coffee. As she sipped the steaming drink, the world felt a little less surreal. The warmth spread through her, anchoring her to the present. But no matter how far she was from the train yard, the memory lingered at the edges of her thoughts. The creature's voice echoed in her mind. "Leave." Cassie stared into her coffee, the dark liquid rippling with the tremble of her hands. She had left. She had obeyed. But the question gnawed at her. Why had it let her go? Had she been lucky? Or had it decided she wasn't a threat? Her phone buzzed on the table, jolting her from her thoughts. It was a message from Jenna. "Home safe yet? Don't let Longlegs get you." Cassie managed a small smile, her fingers hovering over the screen. She typed a quick reply. "I'm fine. You were right about the train yard, though creepy as hell." She hesitated before adding, "I'm done exploring that place. Some things are better left alone." Hitting send, Cassie leaned back in the booth, letting the sounds of the diner wash over her. The clink of dishes, the murmur of the waitress, the hum of fluorescent lights, they were ordinary, grounding, and wonderfully human. And yet, as she finished her coffee and prepared to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that her encounter at the yard wasn't the end of the story. In the back of her mind, a question lingered. What would have happened if she hadn't left? As Cassie drove home under the pale light of the waning moon, a shadow in the corner of her eye made her glance at the rearview mirror, but the road behind her was empty, save for the faint impression of something impossibly tall fading into the mist.